I get a knock at my door. It's one of my younger staff, and I can tell before they even sit down that it's not about a quick coordination question. It's quiet frustration, the kind people try to hide because they think that they shouldn't still be feeling it. So I let them in. They sit down, and there's a pause, but then they say it. I wasn't part of that, and I know exactly what they mean. They slide their screen around and show me a comment that they had received. The window detail is showing one assembly, and the wall section is showing something different. Coordinate. Or something worse. Is this what's called out in the specs? And those aren't red lines that are bothering them. It's what the red line implies. They weren't in the meeting where the wall type was discussed. They weren't copied on the email where the spec section was clarified. They didn't even know that conversation happened. So now it just feels like they missed something obvious. And that feeling gets heavy fast. Because once it happens more than once, it stops feeling like a mistake and starts feeling like a pattern. You fix it, and then it shows up again. A different sheet, a different week, but the same kind of comment. And that's where the internal story starts. Maybe I'm behind. Maybe I should already know this. Maybe everyone else sees something I don't. I've sat in that chair. I've read that exact comment. I've stared at a set of drawings thinking, I don't even know where this assembly lives. I wasn't part of that conversation. And here's the part nobody talks about. It's frustrating, but it's also embarrassing. Not because you're careless. You do care. You want to get it right. You want to be sharp. You don't want to be the one that keeps getting the same coordination mark. And when you don't even know where the answer lives or where to look for it, it makes you feel small in a room that you're trying to grow in. That's real. So here's what I told them. And it is what I wish someone had told me earlier. Being not part of it is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of responsibility. We'll talk about that. You're listening to The Practice of Practice, a podcast for architects, designers, and emerging professionals navigating the gap between school and real work. We focus on the realities most people only learn through experience: workflow, judgment, responsibility, and time. It's not theory, it's practice. I let them talk. They start listing it off. It keeps happening. I fixed it last time. I didn't even know where there's a spec section for that. I wasn't even in that coordination meeting. And underneath all of it, what they're really saying is, I'm trying. That's the part people miss. Nobody who cares enough to walk in your office is lazy. They're frustrated because they care. They're frustrated because they don't want to feel behind. And that word sits there quietly. Behind. It doesn't get said out loud often, but it's there. Because once you get the same comment twice, it feels like you're late to something everyone else already understands. You start replaying it in your head. Should I have known that? Was it obvious? Did I miss something basic? And then the anger creeps in. Not loud anger, but internal anger. Why didn't anybody tell me that? How was I supposed to know that assembly changed? Why does everyone act like I should already see this stuff? I remember that feeling. Reading a comment like, is this what's called out in the specs? And thinking, I didn't even know I was responsible for checking that. Specs weren't something we were introduced to early. They were this other document, this parallel world, and more than likely something that showed up at the end, that's something someone else handled. Until suddenly it wasn't. Until suddenly a comment made it clear that drawings and specs are not separate conversations. And here's the deeper part nobody explains when you're early. Specs are invisible until they're not. In school, you obsess over drawings, plans, sections, details. That's what gets pinned up. That's what gets critiqued. That's what earns praise. Specs feel distant. They're administrative or they're secondary. So when you start in practice, you treat them like a parallel track, something someone else is managing, something that shows up at the end. Until one day it doesn't match your drawing, and now the question isn't about your drafting, it's about your awareness. Is this what's called out in the specs? That question exposes something most people won't admit early on. You don't actually know where Division 8 lives. You don't know how to search the PDF. You don't know which section governs that door frame condition. You've never been taught how drawings and specs divide responsibility. And nobody formally sits you down and walks through that. You have to learn it the hard way. You open the spec book and realize it's not a separate document. It's the other half of the project. That's a moment because once you see that, you can't unsee it. You realize coordination isn't just drawing to drawing, it's drawing to spec, spec to schedule, schedule to detail. And the embarrassment you felt wasn't about intelligence, it was about exposure. Exposure to something you were never explicitly trained to see. That's when you start understanding that practice is bigger than the sheets. But here's the part that shifts the room when I say it. I let them vent. I nod. I tell them I felt it. And then I say, okay, so now what are you going to do about it? Because the frustration is valid, but staying in it is optional. They get quiet when I ask that. Not defensive, just still. Because up until that point, it's been about what happened to them, the red line, the meeting they weren't in, the spec section they didn't even know existed. But now it shifts, and now it's about what they're going to do next. I don't say it harshly, but I do say it clearly. Waiting to be included is a career limiter. Not because anyone is trying to hold you back, but because practice doesn't move toward passive people. Everyone's buried. Project managers are juggling deadlines. Principals are in back-to-back calls. Consultants are trying to keep up with revisions. No one is sitting around and thinking, let's make sure they feel fully looped in. The assumption is that you will look, that you will ask, that you will trace it. And if you don't, the gap stays. When you read coordinate, you have two choices. Fix the detail or figure out why it conflicted. When you read, is this what's called out in the specs? You can answer the question, or you can open the spec book and actually find out how it connects. And that's the difference. One is reactive. One is initiative. An initiative compounds in this profession. If you wait for someone to give you all the answers, you'll never get all the answers. Not because people are unhelpful, but because the pace is too fast. Because the expectation is that you'll start building your own map. The silence you feel when you realize you weren't part of the conversation, that's not exclusion. That's an invitation to step further in. Ask where the wall type is defined. Ask where the assembly lives. Ask to see the previous issued set. Ask why the structural grid drives that alignment. And if you don't know how to ask, then start by looking. Open up the legends. Open the schedules. Search through the keynotes. Trace the tag. You're allowed to do that. You don't need permission to understand the project. That's the shift. The uncomfortable part is realizing that some of the gap isn't access, it's initiative. And that's not an insult, it's empowering because initiative is within your control. I've seen it over and over. The designers who grow fast are not the ones who never get redlined. They're the ones who treat red lines like breadcrumbs. They follow them. They don't just fix the one sheet. They scan the set. They connect it. They ask more questions than everyone else. And people notice that, not in a loud way, not with applause or praise, but quietly, because initiative feels different than confusion. It reads differently. If you say, I wasn't part of that, it closes the conversation. But when you say, well, where's that defined? It opens one. And that difference changes your trajectory. I always lean back when I say this part because this is where the motivation starts to move. You are not behind, but you cannot stay passive. No one is coming to hand you the whole picture. You build it piece by piece. And the moment you decide to look further instead of waiting, everything starts to accelerate. It doesn't mean you won't get redlined again. You will. but the red lines will feel different. And because now you're chasing the understanding instead of waiting for it, that's when frustration turns into momentum. Now let's talk about why it keeps repeating, because this is the part that really gets under your skin. You step up. You start asking more questions. You try to look further, and still a few weeks later, another coordination comment shows up. Different location, but same type of issue. And that's when that doubt creeps back in. So here's what actually is happening. You're correcting markups, but you're still building the map. Those are two different processes. When you fix a window detail that doesn't match the wall section, you solve that location. But unless you understand why the wall assembly changed in the first place, you haven't solved the system. That assembly might appear in another detail, in a head condition, in an enlarged plan, in a spec reference, or in a door schedule note. Drawings are not isolated sheets. They're layers of the same decision echoing across the set. And early in your career, you don't see that echo yet. You see the sheet in front of you, or you see the markup. You fix it, and then you move on. But experienced architects don't just see the sheet. They see the ripple. They know that if one assembly changes, 5 other places might need to get fixed. That's not because they're smarter. It's because they've been burned enough times to anticipate it. Anticipation is earned. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It forms when you connect consequences. I remember the first time a coordination miss turned into a change order. It wasn't dramatic or catastrophic, but just expensive enough to sting. We had a condition that didn't align. The assembly shown in one location didn't match how it was described somewhere else. It made sense to us on paper. It even looked clean. And then a contractor questioned it during her clarification, which turned into a revision, which made an increased cost. And suddenly, the issue wasn't academic anymore. It wasn't a red line on a screen. It was actual dollars. It was a conversation in a room where the tone started to shift slightly. The owner felt it. It wasn't accusatory, not angry, but just heavier. And that's when something clicked. The problem wasn't that I didn't know how to draw. The problem was that I didn't anticipate the ripple. I corrected locally, but I didn't scan globally. That moment changes how you look at every set after that. You stop thinking in terms of isolated fixes. You start asking, if this changes here, what else moves? And that's when anticipation forms. Not because someone gave you a checklist, because you felt the consequence. You don't need a massive mistake to learn that lesson. But you do need one moment where the cost of not scanning becomes real. After that, red lines don't feel like criticism. They feel like warnings. And the warnings are useful. Until then, you're operating sheet by sheet. And sheet by sheet thinking creates repeat comments. Not because you're careless, because you're still zoomed in. Rework keeps happening when you fix locally and don't scan globally. That's the shift. After you correct something, pause. Ask yourself, where else does this condition exist? Not in a checklist way, more in a curiosity way. If the wall type changed here, where else is that wall type used? In Revit, if you're using Revit, you can change a wall type, and if you change the thickness of that wall type, it might affect dimensions, or it might affect alignments, it might affect ceiling details, it might affect finish details. There's a lot that could be adjusted after just changing one wall type. If the spec clarified a material here, where else is that material referenced? If the structural grid drives an alignment, what other elements tie back to that grid? You don't need 10 years of experience to start thinking like that. You need awareness. And awareness builds faster when you intentionally look for relationships. The mistake that most early career designers make is thinking that the red line is about precision. Sometimes it is, yeah, but often it's about connection. The comment that you're getting is not saying, you can't draft. It's saying, you missed the relationship. And relationships are invisible until you train yourself to see them. That's why the same type of correction can show up across multiple projects. It's not the project. It's the way you're scanning. When you widen your scan, the repetition decreases. Not overnight, but steadily. Because now you're not just reacting, you're anticipating. And anticipation changes the emotional experience of that rework. Instead of feeling exposed, you start to feel aware. Instead of thinking, I don't know that, you start thinking, where else is this living? That question alone will accelerate your growth. You're not eliminating mistakes, you're just reducing surprise. And reduced surprise equals reduced stress. And that's the part that people don't always connect. Standards, patterns, repeatable ways of scanning, they don't make you rigid, they make you calm. Because the more predictable your internal process becomes, the less chaotic feedback feels. Rework stops feeling like judgment. It starts feeling like refinement, but only after you decide to look beyond the one sheet in front of you. That decision is where the growth begins. There's a subtle point in your career when something shifts. It doesn't happen in a meeting and it does not get announced. You just notice it in the type of comments that you're starting to get. You notice they're different. They're not coordination misses anymore. They're refinements. They're clarifications or edge cases. And that's when you realize the repetition has slowed. Not because you stopped making mistakes, because you stopped being surprised. You started scanning differently. You started checking the legend without being told. You started opening the spec before someone asked. You started catching the wall type conflict before it reached someone else. That's the acceleration. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels steady. But other people feel it. Your PM starts to trust you with more scope, and you get fewer basic corrections. You're pulled into conversations earlier, not because you had to demand access, but because your awareness earned it. That's how initiative compounds. And when you feel that shift, you never go back to waiting. Here's what changes when you do stop waiting. You don't move faster at first. You actually move slower. Not because you're confused, because you're scanning. You finish a detail, and instead of closing the sheet, you pause for a sec. You zoom out a bit, and you think, where else does this show up? You adjust the wall type, and you don't just fix that one call out. You check the schedule. You check the wall section. You glance at the enlarged plan. Not obsessively, but intentionally. That shift alone starts separating you from the version of yourself who kept getting the same markups. And something else changes too. You start to ask different questions. They improve. Instead of saying, I wasn't part of that, you start saying, hey, I saw this wall type changed here. Should we update these other 3 locations as well? That reads differently. That feels different. And that gets noticed. Not because you're showing off, but because you're thinking relationally. That's what offices actually value. Not perfection, not speed, awareness. The more you build that internal map, the less the red lines feel like exposure. They feel like calibration. You start to recognize patterns before they're printed out. You start catching conflicts before they turn into comments. And even when something slips through, you recover faster because now you know where to look. That's the confidence shift. It doesn't come from someone telling you that you're doing great. It comes from feeling your own anticipation forming. From knowing that when something changes, you instinctively scan the ripple. That's when rework changes categories. It moves from the same coordination comments over and over and over to refinement, alignment, and clarity. That's growth. And it's earned, not by waiting, but looking further. Let's go back to that moment. You're staring at the red line. The window detail is showing one assembly, and the wall section is showing something different. Coordinate this. Or is this what's called out in the specs comment? And then your first thought, again, is I was not part of that. That feeling is real, but it's not permanent. You weren't behind. You were building awareness. And now you know what to do with it. Stop waiting to be included. Start looking further. Ask the extra question. Trace the condition. Scan the set. Because waiting limits you. Initiative accelerates you. Rework isn't a verdict, it's information. And what you do with that information determines how fast you grow. The practice of architecture is not intuitive, but it is learnable. So don't worry, we'll keep building from here. This podcast only works if it gets passed along, not because of me, but because the hardest parts of practice are usually learned in isolation. If this episode put words to something you've been struggling with, share it with someone earlier in practice, or leave a comment naming the moment that hit. I'm doing this because I remember how long it took to realize that I wasn't behind. I just wasn't being taught. Most of what feels like a personal failure in this profession is actually a shared pattern. The more we name those patterns, the faster we all get better. I'll see you in the next one.